Thank you, Deputy Speaker. As the member for Paterson has been saying, it is really good to see some movement on this. There hasn't been a lot of outcomes from the fires of last summer. The inquiries are still happening. There's tentative recommendations, but we haven't seen a lot of action. So I'm really pleased to see that Defence can get its stuff together and get a bunch of recommendations through to be considered by this parliament. And I note that we do have some questions about some of the issues and look forward to it being considered by the Senate and for us to make a final view about it. But, Deputy Speaker, as we saw in the Blue Mountains and Hawkesbury in my electorate firsthand throughout summer, the Australian Defence Force played an absolutely vital role in assisting our community during that emergency, and that applies to such a range of emergencies and disasters across the rest of the country. In our case, the Richmond RAF base was a hive of activity, and there was never a more hopeful sound than that of a plane full of fire retardant heading towards the smoke. People were very pleased to see those planes. There are some planes I don't want to see over my electorate, and there are others I'm very happy to see. The planes and their crew were supported by the entire base. I know that leave was cancelled and permanent Defence personnel and reserves alike threw everything that they had into making sure those tankers could get in and back out as fast as possible in what was some of the darkest days for our small communities. The RAF provided space in the workshop and maintenance hangars, and it provided accommodation and catering support for firefighters. So across the whole gamut, they were there for us. In the first month of the campaign, between 150 and 300 firefighters from Victoria's Country Fire Authority were fed and watered at the base, and the same went for others as the months went on. The RAF aircraft, including the C-130 Hercs, were used to bring firefighters from interstate and take them elsewhere. 37 Squadron was kept busy. In November alone, as an example, they brought South Australian firefighters from Adelaide up to Port Macquarie in New South Wales. Tasmanian firefighters were carried from Hobart to Port Macquarie, and Victorian firefighters from Essendon and Mildura up to Armidale. So our RAF base didn't just support the fire effort in the immediate area of the Blue Mountains and the Hawkesbury. They supported the fire effort up and down the eastern seaboard. And it really does highlight how important that base itself is as a facility. There is periodically talk about closing of the Richmond RAF base, that it's outlived its usefulness. But I cannot imagine there ever being a good reason to give up that strip of tarmac on the edge of our largest city. It isn't just a base for our emergency operations overseas when international crises occur where we lend a hand in the Pacific or in Asia, but as last summer showed, it is pivotal in our ability to deal with the Gospers fire and, in fact, fires up and down Victoria, New South Wales and into Queensland. And across to the west from, we sometimes think about bushfires being on that eastern seaboard, but also those that occur in further west. There is so much capacity at the base, either by drawing on the Defence resources that are already there or by potentially building up alongside the Defence forces the additional skills for bushfire defence. We could be training our own firefighting pilot crews there, for instance. We could be researching the effectiveness of various firefighting techniques and honing our ability to respond fast to fires. But what we saw should leave nobody in any doubt that it is an absolutely essential base now for our firefighting efforts in summer. And as we know and we expect that fires will become more frequent, not less, they will be of greater ferocity, not less, it remains absolutely crucial. We had RAF personnel, including 22 Squadron, plus Army Reserves, were not just working off the base, but they were working at the RFS headquarters when I'd turn up for the early morning briefings in Wilberforce. They'd often be there unloading pallets of stuff or getting ready to deliver eskies of food to the fireground. They were out at Bilpin providing supplies for the firefighters as the volunteers working in preparing the meals for the firefighters as the guys and women came in from a long, hard shift or were heading out for one. Everywhere I went, I caught moments with our reservists and our permanent personnel helping out. They were there once the fire had gone through. They were there, long after the flames had cleared, for many, many weeks, helping to clear dangerous trees from trails in places like Blackheath, Bell and Mount Victoria. Now, I witnessed all of that last summer, and I give a heartfelt thanks to the Defence Force personnel for their service on behalf of the people in the electorate of Macquarie and beyond. We all watched on TV, way outside my electorate, at what the Navy was doing down on the south coast and into Victoria. And so I think none of us have any doubt about the role that the Defence Force can play in something like a bushfire. But we've also seen with the pandemic the role that can be played during other types of disasters or emergencies. And that's why I am really pleased to see that there is some intent to improve the way in which their role is activated and defined. I think that there could have been a greater role for Defence during the fires. They have the skill, they have the training, they have the mindset. And we need to do more work about what that role is and what role they play in the future. None of us in New South Wales will forget the confusion that surrounded the activation of their role and the clear discord between the Premier of New South Wales and the Prime Minister. We need to get things right so that we don't have those sorts of disagreements playing out in the midst of a disaster. We need to get the legal stuff right. This bill will make several changes to the administrative arrangements for the use of ADF personnel, and particularly when reservists are called out. The changes follow the review by Defence after last bushfire season, and I do hope they take into account the experience of Defence during the current pandemic. The aim of the bill is to simplify arrangements, particularly for advising the Governor-General prior to the issuing of an order to call out the reserves. That's a really good thing. It'll increase flexibility, hopefully in terms of the types and periods of services that reserves render during a call-out, rather than just requiring one continuous full-time service call. So having some flexibility clearly was what was needed during the bushfires. The changes will also look at the immunity that's provided in certain circumstances from civil and criminal liability for Defence personnel and other designated protected persons responding to an emergency, similar to those that are enjoyed by civil emergency services. That is really important and has come up in discussions that I've had with people. And so getting that bit right will be really key. And I note we are aware of some concerns about that part of the bill around the immunity provisions and potential interpretations of that, and I think there is real value in the Senate taking a look at that before we form a final position on it. I also welcome the fact that this does look at addressing the current arrangements that mean reserves who are providing continuous full-time service during a call-out don't receive superannuation, and they're the sorts of basic things we just need to get right. So I welcome this legislation, and I do think that we're coming up to nearly 12 months after the fires began, and there hasn't been a lot of change that we've seen. And I talk about this from a perspective of what people are seeing on the ground as well as what we're seeing here. There's been lots of talk, but there hasn't been a lot of tangible action. There's still a lot to do, and just to be clear that this place recognises the work is far from over in bushfire-affected areas. There's been no significant planning to reduce the impact of bushfires. We still have the $4 billion emergency response fund that this place voted on, I think it was 18 months ago, and we've not seen a cent spent. Nothing in my electorate to say, here's how we will make things better for next time. That is really disappointing, and while it's good to see this type of legislation, there's so much more that can be happening. We're not seeing an injection of funds into the community to really tackle the enormous environmental issues that we face. There are small amounts of money that are just starting to trickle through, but we're into the next fire season. We failed to get environmentalists out on the ground and researchers out on the ground fast to do early audits of what had been lost. We've missed that opportunity now. So why aren't we seeing legislation here that would set up a fund that allows, in the case of an emergency, researchers to be taken off their existing projects and allowed to park those? You know, parking a project in a research context, academics tell me, is just an impossible thing to do. But why aren't we making it easier so they can sideline certain research and divert their energies into the stuff that can only happen in a tiny little window of opportunity in our World Heritage Area? We have missed that opportunity to really understand the impact. We'll now be starting to see which bits recover and which bits don't, but we're never getting that ground zero data that would have been so useful. That's the sort of legislation I'd like to see here, some real planning around how we respond to these sorts of disasters going forward. The other thing we're not seeing in this place is any commitment to fix one of the fundamental issues for communities like mine, which is around a failure of mobile communication. There were people in my electorate who had no way to make a phone call as fires were bearing down on them. There were brigades who had no way to activate their brigade, no way to communicate because of a failure of communication. Now we're meant to be seeing a sat phone in every rural fire brigade. Well, that's great, but who are you going to call? The other rural fire brigade, the other rural fire station, because you can't get onto your actual fire brigade members because they don't have communication. So the failure to tackle and to make any provision for improved telecommunications is a fundamental flaw and leaves people's lives at risk. The lives of people in the Blue Mountains and Hawkesbury and many other areas are at risk because of that. And that's something that we don't need recommendations for, we just need to fix that problem. And this government has failed miserably to do that. And that's why there is some unease in my community. They look at the areas that were fire affected, and I was in Mount Tomah just on Friday with the Shadow Minister Jason Clare, and what we identified was not a single house has begun construction in that area. As far as I can establish, there are only 2 pre-DAs of all the 40 houses that burnt down, and we didn't lose hundreds of homes, not this time. That was the last fire, we lost hundreds. But this time, the pace of the recovery is so slow that there aren't homes being rebuilt yet. So these are the sorts of things that this parliament really needs to consider and put in place mechanisms so that recovery can happen faster. I think ultimately what I'm saying, Deputy Speaker, is great. This is a step forward, but gee, it's a small step. It's a terrific step from a defence personnel perspective, and I know the clarity that it ultimately provides, my community will be grateful for. The RAF personnel and the Army and Navy personnel and reservists who live in my electorate will be grateful for that clarity. The community who might face disaster, and you know, we're not just talking bushfire in the electorate of Macquarie, we do floods, we do storms, you name it, it probably happens in my electorate. Tsunamis not so much. But what we need is confidence in the government that things are in place so that it can happen much faster. You know, I worry less about a Prime Minister being overseas than the mechanisms being put in place, and they clearly weren't. Personally, I couldn't sleep while the beds were burning. I needed to be out in my electorate every day. That was my approach to it. And what I saw was great people doing incredible work, but they didn't have the things in place that would have made their lives better, that would have made the decisions quicker and faster, and may well have meant a different outcome for some of my communities. You know, we had fire-affected 80% of the Blue Mountains World Heritage Area. 80% of it, the fire went through. If we could have reduced that, we might be seeing less of an environmental disaster unfolding there. While some parts of it are recovering, and there's the wonderful furry trees with the new green growth going from the bottom of the trunk right up the top, there are others where they're just still black ash, simply a burnt forest standing, never to recover for the foreseeable future.